Okay, welcome. So last week on Thursday, there was a local election in the UK, and today I want to talk a little bit about how badly the Conservatives did, and could that be linked in any way to the boarding education that they received. Okay, so just got some thoughts. I've been reading a few different books, Decade in Tory, and then James O'Brien's How They Broke Britain, and then linking that in with Wounded Leaders from Nick Duffell. And I'm just kind of reflecting on last week, the Tory parties and Labour did very bad in the local elections. And some are saying, that's no problem. Others are saying, that it's the death of the Tories, that it's the basic collapse of the Tories. And certainly Nigel Farage, his party Reform UK, they did very well in the elections, and the Tories did very, very badly. And he's saying, it's basically they're not going to recover. So I just wanted to talk a little bit today about some of the ideas that maybe there's a reason behind the collapse of the Tories, and and could it be linked to boarding school? I don't know, but it's just some hypotheses I have. So if I begin with, I feel one of the things which has changed is that the media has changed. In the past, the Tories, the Labour, any reporting would come through mainstream media, which was very much controlled, often by public school. Still nowadays, Daily Mail, owned by an ex-boarder, obviously Rupert Murdoch, and the News International, he's an ex-boarder. So it's very tightly controlled by people, from the public schools. Whereas now how it's changed is it's opening up to, for example, this video, or it's opening up to other people like GB News or other independent news stations which are reporting. So people are getting information from all different sides. And so people can make up their own decisions. And, for example, in this book here, by Russell Jones, he's just pointing out some of the data of what they've done. And in the past, this wouldn't have been reported upon unless you were a journalist. Now you can do the research yourself. You can go onto Google, you can go onto the different newspapers, you can actually do the data research. And I'll read a little bit from Russell Jones about the Tory party. He says, at Christmas 1834, the statesman and politician John Peel delivered his Tamworth Manifesto, laying down the founding principles of a new politics for Britain. His movement would not undertake radical sudden changes, but would embrace a careful review of institutions and deliver judicious reform once it was certain its plans would ensure the correction of proved abuses and redress of real grievances. It would bring about constancy, responsibility, substance, and modest change. No longer would Britons live in a perpetual vortex of agitation. With that pledge to the nation, Peel conjured into life the modern Conservative Party. That was 1834. But he continues to say, at the end of 2020, we reached a milestone of 10 successive years of Conservative rule. And obviously it went on for another 4 years after that, till 2024. During that decade, there has never been more than 365 Tory MPs. This book names 156 of them in its by no means comprehensive account of demonstrable lies, relentless incompetence, epic waste, serial corruption, sexual and physical assaults, official police investigations, illegal drug use, excessive alcohol consumption, addition to register of sex pests, anti-democratic practices, abuse of power, and basically so on. He says that's almost half of them. Tory MPs, I mean. So it's just kind of fascinating to just kind of see that. Now, what then has that to do with boarding schools? So, according to the Sutton Trust, and these were figures from a couple of years ago, that about 70% of lawyers, and I'm not entirely sure of the figures for the civil service, but often politicians, it's often about 50% have been to private school or boarding school. And certainly John Major's cabinet in the 1990s, he had 70% of his cabinet was boarding school, ex-boarding school. Liz Truss's government from a couple of years ago, 75% of her cabinet was public school, boarding school. Kwasi Kwarteng, he went to Eton, and so on and so on. So while, I don't know the exact figures, many of the Conservatives over the years have been to boarding schools. And as you know from my work, there's a very specific set of traits which come from that. Will Hutton, the journalist, the writer, he says that in his research he's found that over the centuries the Tory party has consistently made poor decisions. And he talks about the corn tax, the poll tax. You've got all these different things that they've implemented, and it all has come down to short-termism. They'll just think about the short term. How much profit can we make, rather than thinking long-term. And that kind of will lead me into Nick and wounded leaders. And Nick talks about, and I've obviously gone through this many times before, but he talks about how the boarding education is very much about short-termism. It just accesses one part of the brain, so it's just accessing the left part, the rational part, and he calls it the rational man project. But we've also got the other side, the emotional side, and without that, what he says is, I'll read a little bit. He says that my own clinical practice over nearly a quarter of a century, informed by a hunger for new and old psychotherapeutic models and method, has repeatedly confirmed the problems for adult ex-boarders who have not examined their chronic boarding school survivor personalities, having to disown feelings, softness, in fact all forms of vulnerability so severely during childhood means that all vulnerability is seen as threatening. Consequently, the personality organizes itself in a hyper-defensive way, creating stress but unable to deal with it, being incapable of admitting mistakes or making long-term decisions for the common good, in favor of preponderance of short-term survival-based self-interest dominated solutions. And I see that's kind of what's happened with the Tories over the last 14 years, but this has been going on for a long time. It's just not necessarily been reported, as Will Hutton says. And that is that we, as the Tories, they'll say one thing, right, we're going to do this, and they'll do the complete opposite because they can't almost do the long term. They can only do short term. They only really can think about themselves. And I'll talk a little bit. I know I read this last week, but this was James O'Brien, and he's talking about David Cameron here. And just basically at the beginning, when he goes in, he wins people over by saying the following. He says, some say that we should move to the right. I say that it will turn us into a fringe party, never able to challenge the government again. I don't want that to happen to this party. Do you? To the family trying to keep their heads above water, to provide for their kids and to give them the time they need, we'll say, yes, we believe in the family, because that's the most important thing in the world, is that children are brought up in a stable, loving home. Now, immediately, there's an issue there because he didn't grow up in a stable, loving home. He might have done until he was 7, but from 7 through till 18, he was in a boarding school, Heatherdown, and then he went to Eton. So he wasn't resident. If we talk about this idea of whether you're resident in a country, you need to be in the country for at least 3 months or more. If you're less than, you're considered expat, you're a non-resident. So we were only at home for 3 months. 9 months of the year we were in boarding school, and therefore he had no experience of a loving family because his family was his boarding school. So that was what he wanted. He wanted, we believe in the family. So that's what was the external. but the internal was totally different. You know, it was all about giving to his classmates, you know, that hate of vulnerability. And so what he did over his period in government, they dismantled the welfare state. You know, and I shared this a couple of weeks ago, and this is reported in here, that they said they were going to cut welfare by 6 billion. They ended up cutting it by 81 billion. 81 billion. So yeah, coming back to Nick, you know, so that's the first reason, short-term survival-based solutions. The other thing is, most easily recognized symptom of an ex-boarder is difficulty with emotions. Over the last 20 years, the emerging discipline of neuroscience has confirmed much of what psychotherapists always assumed, chiefly that this is that humans cannot take good decisions when as a result of either physical lesion or psychological dissociation processes, their feelings and emotions are not fully accessible to them. So you can't make a good decision if you don't have access to your emotions, and that's what boarding schools do. They totally cut your emotions down, that you dissociate. So, you know, if so many of these Tory leaders have been to boarding schools, they can't make good decisions. They can't see the big picture, you know. And that's, again, Ian McGilchrist saying that you can't see the big picture if you've been fed on a strict diet of rationality, just one side of the brain. You need, you know, yes, you can have that focus, which is important, but you need the other side to be able to step back. You know, as Cousins and Posner, and also Jim Collins in his book about leadership, says you've got to have intuition. You've got to be able to step back. Yes, you have the facts, the left side, but you've also got to have the right side as well. So yeah, so those are kind of some of the reasons there that I feel, could this be to do with the, you know, boarding school? I don't know, but it's interesting just to explore that. I mean, my own feeling, as I shared last week, is that boarding schools won't exist in 5 to 10 years, because it's like they're no longer creating leaders. That, you know, that it was the command and control leaders. That's what the Tory party was. That doesn't work in modern society. We need emotionally intelligent, heart-centered leaders who care about the people, not who say one thing and then they do the opposite. And we now know through the media that, oh, this is happening over and over and over and over again. And so it's exciting that a new generation of leaders are being birthed. And I think, yeah, I'll finish by just coming back to this book here, Rutger Bregman, Humankind. And he basically says in here that it's really exciting. He says, we always think that we are we're bad, there's something wrong with us. You know, he says the difference between planet A and planet B, planet A being he gives an example of a plane coming into land and crashing, and saying planet A, everyone helps the other people. So the old, the infirm, and the children are kind of ushered to the front. That's planet A. Planet B is, you know, it's just dog eat dog and people pushing. And he says, most of us believe that we live on planet B, but the reality is we live on planet A. We are a good people. And he says the reason we believe it's planet B is because of the media. So it's just really fascinating. So I think that's a really important place to leave it on. It's very positive at the moment. I feel it's very exciting. Things are changing. You know, we have to keep having that vision of that change can happen. We can have a society where we are humankind. We are kind, and we have leaders who reflect that as well. And it's up to us really to decide that. It's like, who do we vote in? Who, you know, what are the systems we want to create in our local government? What are the systems we want to create more globally? So yeah, just some ideas and thoughts there, just kind of piecing these together as I generally do, kind of think over these. And I hope this has been helpful. Please do comment below if this, you know, sparks something. And yeah, if you have any thoughts and questions about the Tory party, and certainly Labour has been really negatively impacted as well by the results last week. So yeah, I just think it's interesting, fascinating time. So, okay, take care.